America's young men are lost. At least that's what they're telling us online. From feeling disconnected in school, relationships, and even purpose, to loneliness. Our nation's boys are turning to the internet for answers and guidance. And that's where they find the manosphere, a world of influencers promoting strength, stoicism, and often misogyny. Extremely Normal, a new investigative series by USA Today's extremism reporter Will Carless, examines how extremist and fringe ideas and movements have moved into America's mainstream. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Today we're diving into one part of Extremely Normal, the manosphere. What is it and how it can devolve from ideas about fitness and discipline into something darker. We'll step into the manosphere space to see what teenage boys and young men in their 20s are consuming online and to understand how it's shaping their worldview. Will, welcome back to the excerpt.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with a full definition. What is the manosphere?
Well, the sort of most accepted definition of the manosphere is essentially a collection of podcasters and influencers, pretty much exclusively, if not exclusively male, who preach a mix of essentially self-help, fitness, taking control of your life. But the concerning side of it is that there's often a misogynistic or an anti-female or at least an anti-feminist element to their messaging. So essentially they're playing into the sadness and the desperation that you mentioned in your intro among young men. And the excuse that they give young men is basically the reason that you feel like this is because of women and because of the way that women treat men and because of the way that men are treated. And that's the sort of underlying message of the manosphere.
Well, you've covered extremism in the United States for years now. Tell us more about what drove you to explore this topic of young men in particular. What question or questions were you hoping to answer?
It's a couple of things. I mean, firstly, I think that this is an enormous issue. We're not talking about some little fringe movement or some really extremist sort of small group of a few dozen or a few hundred people. We're talking about millions upon millions of young men in America who are receiving this messaging. So firstly, it's the scale of it. Secondly, one of the sources that we interviewed in the piece, Cynthia Miller-Idris, just completed a book. And that book looks at the relationship between the manosphere and toxic masculinity and the broader issue of extremist violence. And it shows that almost always when you have sort of young extremists who go out and commit, whether it's shootings or bombings or some other sort of act of mass violence, they have a background in misogyny and in toxic masculinity. So this is really seen among experts in extremism as a breeding ground for other extremists. It's also a entry point. So a lot of young men will find their way to viewpoints like anti-Semitism, like white supremacy through the manosphere. So we took a look at all the issues facing not just young people, but Americans today. And this was really top of our list of what we're concerned about and we think people need to know about.
You ended up going to a gym in Fontana, California to find some young men to talk with about your piece. Tell us about someone who stood out to you there.
So this young man, Arthur Espinosa, he's a 17-year-old. He lives there in Fontana and he's an aspiring MMA fighter. And we spent some time with him over a couple of days.
I love to fight. I always watched these UFC fighters on TV. The first one I've watched was like 2 years ago, and I've been addicted ever since. Before the gym, I really didn't have anywhere to go. I was just home. So me going to the gym, it keeps me busy, and I'm doing something I love, and I love being there.
What did Espinoza tell you about his online influences?
Well, it was really eye-opening. I don't know how much time our viewers spend around teenage boys and young men, and obviously I'm sure there's a vast spectrum, but I don't spend a lot of time around teenage boys. And I didn't realize the extent to which the internet, not just the internet, but particularly online influencers and streaming video have really become a sort of a resource, almost like an encyclopedia or a Wikipedia for young men and how they deal with their emotions and the challenges that they face in everyday life. So what Arthur told me is that if he has a problem or if he has an emotion that he's dealing with, he'll immediately go on TikTok or on Instagram and try and find videos from influencers that he respects and that he looks up to that talk about how to deal with these problems. And that was true among all the young men that we talked to. This is where they go to understand the world and to understand what's going on inside their heads and in their emotions.
As you said, some of these influencers start with self help and fitness advice, but then introduce more extreme or misogynistic views. Why is that such an effective pipeline?
Basically, who can argue with the idea that you should make your bed in the morning and that you should do some sit ups and that you should eat healthily and that you should take care of yourself? And these are all pretty much universal truths in the self-help world. And so that's what these men do. They usually sort of appear shirtless on their videos and they show how kind of buff and strong they are and they say, hey, you can be like me. And so they introduce it oftentimes in terms of physical fitness or through the martial arts or MMA world. They basically tell people you need to train your body in order to train your mind. So that's the entry point. And I will say an awful lot of influencers out there, that's where they stop. That's what they do. They introduce that and that's what they do. But there's also a subset of this that we really put inside the manosphere, and that is these men who go beyond that and start talking about women and start talking about the negative influence of women. They talk about the positive influence of women too, but they also instill in young men these very disturbing ideas about controlling women, about how to sort of get women and how it's all about control and it's all about basically trumping the feminist world that is against them and those sorts of things. So to answer your question, it's a very effective way of drawing people in because it's a non-controversial message.
Andrew Tate is one of the leading figureheads in the manosphere. He's an American British social media personality and former professional kickboxer. And his extreme views got him expelled from various social media platforms. Recently, he was accused by the right wing influencer Lauren Southern of assault, which Tate denies. What did the young men you spoke with say about Andrew Tate?
They love him. They think he's the model. They think that he's the guy that they want to be and that they look up to. I mean, I heard that again and again from these young men. They want his lifestyle. They want to be flying around on private jets and smoking Cuban cigars and hanging out with models. I mean, that's the lifestyle that he presents to them, and they pretty much worship him and they all want to be him. They did say that they were somewhat concerned or at least turned off by some of the things that he says about women. And they said that they were able to differentiate between his positive messaging and his negative messaging, and that often his negative messaging was, as they put it, was just for views and to wind people up and just for jokes. But overall, they're huge fans.
Well, why do you think so many young men today are turning to influencers on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram for advice on relationships and identity instead of parents or teachers or mentors?
Well, firstly, I mean, some of the men that we talked to were quick to point out that they do have those positive influences inside the home too, and that they say that that's what allows them to differentiate between joking around and when messaging turns sour and turns wrong. And this is really at the crux of this story in this project, is that these influencers don't just talk to sort of 25-year-olds with healthy home lives and parents they can talk to and friend groups. They also talk to lonely and very influenceable young men, frankly, like Arthur Espinosa, who's 17, who comes from a broken home and lives with his grandparents. These are the places that young men like that go to understand the world and to learn about why they feel the way they do. And more often than not, the messaging that they're getting from these toxic online influencers is, it's not your fault. You have to blame women and you have to kind of control and take power over women. I'm not saying that that is every single person that watches these men. There's an awful lot of young men out there who do have positive role models, who do also take influence from other influencers who aren't as negative about women. But there's a good proportion of young men who don't have those sort of safeguards and don't have those positive male role models, don't have positive female role models in their lives, and who are eating up this advice and this explanation of the world around them and taking it into their adult lives.
You also spoke with people who are actively working to intervene and guide these young men into more positive avenues. Tell us about Jason Wilson and his work.
That's right. We didn't want to just focus on the negative. And so we spent a lot of time researching and talking to people and trying to find out someone who's doing it right, someone who's out there talking about all the positive self-help stuff about taking care of your body and your mind and being fit and healthy and committed and everything else. And we found Jason, and Jason's an extraordinary man. He runs an organization in Detroit, Michigan, where he trains young men, but doesn't just train them physically. He also works with young men in his community to try and focus them, to try and push them in the right direction in life, to try and make sure that they're getting a good start in life. And by all accounts, he's helped thousands of young men develop their minds, develop their bodies, and step into life with a positive set of attributes that doesn't involve placing blame on women or sort of leaking into misogyny in any way. Can we talk a little bit about this idea of a crisis among the nation's young men?
I believe we've always been in trouble. We just did a better job at hiding it. There wasn't social media. We didn't have the knowledge of how dangerous it is to repress your emotions. I see with the young men that I serve, we've been doing this now in the union, our nonprofit, for over 22 years. And I've never seen so many boys with a great fear of failure, hyper anxious, even apathy at times. I often tell men and young men that there's no freedom in the facade, and this Superman cape that we've been wearing for decades is now strangling the life out of men.
What's the biggest takeaway you want to leave viewers and listeners with from your investigation?
I think for parents of young men, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by this, and essentially impossible for parents to know what their children are consuming online. It's not really possible. So I think what parents need to do is to make sure that they're talking with their children about these influences. They're talking with their children and at least understanding to some extent who they're watching and what they're listening to, and ensuring that they frankly can get other viewpoints in front of them. So people like Jason Wilson and the other hundreds of positive male influences that are out there. But I think what we heard from the young men was they claimed we can tell the difference between what is a positive message and what is a negative message. And the reason we can do that is because we've learned from our parents and they've told us this. But they said it's young men who don't have that positive influence. So I think the biggest takeaway is parents need to be talking to their children about these issues. They need to be kind of grappling with them, and they need to be pushing back when they hear their sons expressing misogynistic or anti-women or anti-feminist viewpoints. They need to be pushing back on that and really discussing it with them, and just making sure that they're not only hearing one side of the story from some of these men who are making a lot of money, apart from anything else, and gaining a lot of influence with these kind of toxic messages.
It's always good speaking with you, Will. Thank you so much for being on The Excerpt.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.